Korean Buddhism is distinguished from other forms of Buddhism by its attempt to resolve what it sees as inconsistencies in Mahayana Buddhism. Early Korean monks believed that the traditions they received from foreign countries were internally inconsistent. To address this, they developed a new holistic approach to Buddhism. This approach is characteristic of virtually all major Korean thinkers, and has resulted in a distinct variation of Buddhism, which is called Tongbulgyo, a form that sought to harmonize all disputes by Korean scholars. Korean Buddhist thinkers refined their predecessors' ideas into a distinct form. As it now stands, Korean Buddhism consists mostly of the Seon lineage, primarily represented by the Jogye and Taego Orders. The Korean Seon has a strong relationship with other Mahayana traditions that bear the imprint of Chan teachings as well as the closely related Zen. Other sects, such as the modern revival of the Cheontae lineage, the Jingak Order, and the newly formed one, have also attracted sizable followings. Korean Buddhism has also contributed much to East Asian Buddhism, especially to early Chinese, Japanese, and Tibetan schools of Buddhist thought. Historical overview of the development of Korean Buddhism. When Buddhism was originally introduced to Korea from former Qin in 372, or about 800 years after the death of the historical Buddha, shamanism was the indigenous religion. As it was not seen to conflict with the rites of nature worship, Buddhism was allowed to blend in with shamanism. Thus, the mountains that were believed to be the residence of spirits in pre-Buddhist times became the sites of Buddhist temples. Korean shamanism held three spirits in especially high regard: Sanshin, Toksong and Chilsong. Korean Buddhism accepted and absorbed these three spirits and, even today, special shrines are set aside for them in many temples. The mountain spirit receives particular recognition in an attempt to appease the local mountain spirits, on whose land the temple stands. This blend of Buddhism and shamanism became known as Korean Buddhism, although the fundamental teachings of the Buddha remained. Though it initially enjoyed wide acceptance, even being supported as the state ideology during the Goryeo period, Buddhism in Korea suffered extreme repression during the Joseon era, which lasted over 500 years. During this period, Neo-Confucianism overcame the prior dominance of Buddhism. Only after Buddhist monks helped repel the Japanese invasions of Korea did the persecution of Buddhism and Buddhist practitioners stop. Buddhism in Korea remained subdued until the end of the Joseon period, when its position was strengthened somewhat by the Colonial period, which lasted from 1910 to 1945. After World War II, the Seon school of Korean Buddhism once again gained acceptance. A 2005 government survey indicated that about a quarter of South Koreans identified as Buddhist. However, the actual number of Buddhists in South Korea is ambiguous as there is no exact or exclusive criterion by which Buddhists can be identified, unlike the Christian population. With Buddhism's incorporation into traditional Korean culture, it is now considered a philosophy and cultural background rather than a formal religion. As a result, many people outside of the practicing population are deeply influenced by these traditions. Thus, when counting secular believers or those influenced by the faith while not following other religions, the number of Buddhists in South Korea is considered to be much larger. Similarly, in officially atheist North Korea, while Buddhists officially account for 4.5% of the population, a much larger number of the population are influenced by Buddhist philosophies and customs. Buddhism in the Three Kingdoms. When Buddhism was introduced to Korea in the 4th century CE, the Korean peninsula was politically subdivided into three kingdoms: Goryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Silla in the southeast. There is concrete evidence of an earlier introduction of Buddhism than traditionally believed. A mid-4th century tomb, unearthed near Pyongyang, is found to incorporate Buddhist motifs in its ceiling decoration. Some Korean Buddhist monks traveled to China or India in order to study Buddhism in the late Three Kingdoms period, especially in the 6th century. In 526, the monk Gyeomik from Baekje traveled via the southern sea route to India to learn Sanskrit and study Vinaya. The monk Phaya from Goryeo is said to have studied under the Cheontae master Tsin, and other Korean monks of the period brought back numerous scriptures from abroad and conducted missionary activity throughout Korea. Several schools of thought developed in Korea during these early times. The Samnon or East Asian Madhyamaka school focused on Madhyamaka doctrine. The Jeol school was mainly concerned with the study and implementation of Angstramala moral discipline. The Yeolban school, which was based in the themes of the Mahayana Mahaparinirvana to the first Asatra. Toward the end of the Three Kingdoms period, the Wonyung school was formed. It would lead the actualization of the metaphysics of interpenetration as found in the Avatamsaka Sutra and soon was considered the premier school, especially among the educated aristocracy. This school was later known as Wariam and was the longest-lasting of these imported schools. It had strong ties with the Beopseong, the indigenous Korean school of thought. The date of the first mission from Korea to Japan is unclear, but it is reported that a second detachment of scholars was sent to Japan upon invitation by the Japanese rulers in 577. The strong Korean influence on the development of Buddhism in Japan continued through the unified Silla period. Only in the 8th century did independent study by Japanese monks begin in significant numbers. Goryeo in 372, the monk Sundu was sent by Fujian of former Qin to the court of the king Soshiram of Goryeo. He brought texts and statues, and the Goryeo royalty and their subjects quickly accepted his teachings. Buddhism in China was in a rudimentary form, consisting of the law of cause and effect and the search for happiness. This had much in common with the predominant shamanism, which likely led to the quick assimilation of Buddhism by the people of Goryeo. Early Buddhism in Silla developed under the influence of Goryeo. Some monks from Goryeo came to Silla and preached among the people, making a few converts. In 551, Hyang, a Goryeo monk, was appointed the first national patriarch of Silla. He first presided over the 100-seat Dharma Assembly, and the Dharma of 8 prohibitions. Baekje in 384, the Indian monk Mrananta arrived in Baekje and the royal family received the similar strain of Buddhism he brought. King Joseon of Baekje proclaimed, people should believe in Buddhism and seek happiness. In 526, the Baekje monk Gyeomik went directly to central India and came back with a collection of Vinaya texts, accompanied by the Indian monk Padolta. After returning to Baekje he translated the Buddhist scriptures in Sanskrit into 72 volumes. The Jeol school in Baekje was established by Gyeomik about a century earlier than that of in China. As a result of the work, he is regarded as the father of Vinaya studies in Korea. Silla Buddhism did not enter the kingdom of Silla until the 5th century. The common people were first attracted to Buddhism here, but there was resistance among the aristocrats. In 527, however, a prominent court official named Ikadorn presented himself to King Barafung of Silla and announced he had become Buddhist. The king had him beheaded, but when the executioner cut off his head, it is said that milk poured out instead of blood. Paintings of this are in the temple at Haeinsa and a stone monument honoring his martyrdom is in the National Museum of Gyeongju. During the reign of the next king, Jinung of Silla, the growth of Buddhism was encouraged, eventually being recognized as the national religion of Silla. Additionally, selected young men were physically and spiritually trained at Warangdo according to Buddhist principles to be able to defend the kingdom. King Jinung later became a monk himself. The monk Jijang is credited with having been a major force in the adoption of Buddhism as a national religion. Jijang is also known for his participation in the founding of the Korean Sangha, a type of monastic community. Another great scholar to emerge from the Silla period was Wonhyo. He renounced his religious life to better serve the people and even married a princess for a short time and had a son. He wrote many treatises and his philosophy centered on the unity and interrelatedness of all things. He set off to China to study Buddhism with a close friend, Sang, but only made it part of the way there. The legend is that Wonhyo awoke one night very thirsty, found a container with cool water, drank, and returned to sleep. The next morning he saw the container from which he had drunk was a human skull and he realized all enlightenment depended on the mind. He saw no reason to continue to China, so he returned home. His companion, Sang, continued to China and after studying 10 years, offered a poem to his master in the shape of a seal that geometrically represents infinity. The poem contained the essence of the Avatamsaka Sutra. Buddhism was so successful during this period that many kings converted and cities' places were even renamed after famous places during the time of Buddha. Buddhism in the North-South States period. Unified Silla equals. In 668, the kingdom of Silla succeeded in unifying the whole Korean peninsula, giving rise to a period of political stability that lasted for about 100 years under unified Silla. This led to a high point in the scholarly studies of Buddhism in Korea. In general, the most popular areas of study were Wonyeong, Yasuk or East Asian Yogacara, Jongto or Pure Land Buddhism, and the indigenous Korean Beopseong. Wonhyo taught the Pure Land practice of Yambul, which would become very popular amongst both scholars and laypeople, and has had a lasting influence on Buddhist thought in Korea. His work, which attempts a synthesis of the seemingly divergent strands of Indian and Chinese Buddhist doctrine, makes use of the essence-function framework, which was popular in native East Asian philosophical schools. His work was instrumental in the development of the dominant school of Korean Buddhist thought, known variously as Beopseong, Hwedong and later as Jingdo. Wonhyo's friend Sang went to Chang, where he studied under Huan patriarchs Seon and Fazang. When he returned after 20 years, his work contributed to Warrian Buddhism and became the predominant doctrinal influence on Korean Buddhism together with Wonhyo's Tongbulgyo thought. Warrian principles were deeply assimilated into the Korean meditational school, the Korean Seon school, where they made a profound effect on its basic attitudes. Influences from Silla Buddhism in general, and from these two philosophers in particular, even crept backwards into Chinese Buddhism. Wonhyo's commentaries were very important in shaping the thought of the preeminent Chinese Buddhist philosopher Fazang, and Wonkook's commentary on the Sword of the First Florin Dynamo Kanazatra had a strong influence in Tibetan Buddhism. The intellectual developments of Silla Buddhism brought with them significant cultural achievements in many areas, including painting, literature, sculpture, and architecture. During this period, many large and beautiful temples were built. Two crowning achievements were the temple Bulguksa and the cave retreat of Sokgyeram. Bulguksa was famous for its jeweled pagodas, while Sokgyeram was known for the beauty of its stone sculpture. Balhae Buddhism also flourished in the northern Korean kingdom of Balhae, established after the fall of Goryeo, as the state religion. The remains of 10 Buddhist temples have been found in the remains of the capital of Balhae, Sangyeonji. Together with such Buddhist artifacts as Buddha statuettes and stone lanterns suggest that Buddhism played a predominant role in the life of the Balhae people. Balhae tomb Magyargdal and Sinpo, South Hamgyong Province, are associated with pagodas and temples. This also indicates that Buddhism had a strong influence over the funerary rituals in Balhae. After the fall of Balhae, 60 monks from Balhae including the monk Joseon fled together to the newly founded kingdom of Goryeo. A new epoch in Korean Buddhism began during the latter Silla with the birth of schools of Korean Seon. In China, the movement toward a meditation-based view of practice, which came to be known as Chan Buddhism, had begun during the 6th and 7th centuries, and it was not long before the influence of the new meditational school reached Korea, where it was known as Seon. Meaning meditation, the term is more widely known in the West in its Japanese variant, Zen. Tension developed between the new meditational schools and the previously existing academically oriented schools, which were described by the term Gyo, meaning learning, or study. Kim Gyo-gak, a prince who became a monastic, came to the region of Anhui to Mount Shua in China. Many Chinese Buddhists believe he was indeed the transformation body of Ka to the first pound Itagaba. 2 uncles sent by his mother and wife to call him back also became monastics there. His well-preserved, dehydrated body is seen at the monastery he built on Mount Shua today. The 2 uncles, unable to resist wine and meat as they were official before becoming monastics, practiced in another place on the mount. People built the palace of the 2 saints in their practice place to memorialize them. Many Buddhists visit there. Bomnang, said to be a student of the Chinese master Daoxin, is generally credited with the initial transmission of Chan into Korea. It was popularized by Sin Haeng in the latter part of the 8th century and by Dui at the beginning of the 9th century. From then on, many Koreans studied Chan in China, and upon their return established their own schools at various mountain monasteries with their leading disciples. Initially, the number of these schools was fixed at 9, and Korean Seon was termed the 9 mountain schools at the time. 8 of these were of the lineage of Mazadao, as they were established through connection with either him or one of his eminent disciples. The one exception was the Sumi-san school founded by Ayam, which had developed from the Korodong school. Buddhism as state religion in the Goryeo period. As Buddhism in medieval Korea evolved, it served to legitimize the state. Rise of the Seon. Initially, the new Seon schools were regarded by the established doctrinal schools as radical and dangerous upstarts. Thus, the early founders of the various 9 mountain monasteries met with considerable resistance, repressed by the long influence in court of the Go schools. The struggles which ensued continued for most of the Goryeo period, but gradually the Seon argument for the possession of the true transmission of enlightenment would gain the upper hand. The position that was generally adopted in the later Seon schools, due in large part to the efforts of Jinul, did not claim clear superiority of Seon meditational methods, but rather declared the intrinsic unity and similarities of the Seon and Go viewpoints. Although all these schools are mentioned in historical records, toward the end of the dynasty, Seon became dominant in its effect on the government and society, and the production of noteworthy scholars and adepts. During the Goryeo period, Seon thoroughly became a religion of the state, receiving extensive support and privileges through connections with the ruling family and powerful members of the court. Warrium and Seon. Although most of the scholastic schools waned in activity and influence during this period of the growth of Seon, the Warrium school continued to be a lively source of scholarship well into the Goryeo, much of it continuing the legacy of Sang and Wonhyo. In particular, the work of Goryeo prepared for the reconciliation of Warrium and Seon, with Warrium's accommodating attitude towards the latter. Goryeo's works are an important source for modern scholarship in identifying the distinctive nature of Korean Warrium. Another important advocate of Sangyo unity was Wiccan. Like most other early Goryeo monks, he began his studies in Buddhism with Warrium. He later traveled to China, and upon his return, actively promulgated the Cheontae, which became recognized as another Seon school. This period thus came to be described as 5 doctrinal and 2 meditational schools. Wiccan himself, however, alienated too many Seon adherents, and he died at a relatively young age without seeing a Sangyo unity accomplished. Jinul. The most important figure of Seon in the Goryeo was Jinul. In his time, the Sangha was in a crisis of external appearance and internal issues of doctrine. Buddhism had gradually become infected by secular tendencies and involvements, such as fortune-telling and the offering of prayers and rituals for success in secular endeavors. This kind of corruption resulted in the profusion of increasingly larger numbers of monks and nuns with questionable motivations. Therefore, the correction, revival, and improvement of the quality of Buddhism were prominent issues for Buddhist leaders of the period. Jinul sought to establish a new movement within Seon which he called the Samadhayan Praja ± a society, whose goal was to establish a new community of disciplined, pure-minded practitioners deep in the mountains. He eventually accomplished this mission with the founding of Sungwangsa at Mount Jogye. Jinul's works are characterized by a thorough analysis and reformulation of the methodologies of Seon study and practice. One major issue that had long fermented in Chan, and which received special focus from Jinul, was the relationship between gradual and sudden methods in practice and enlightenment. Drawing upon various Chinese treatments of this topic, most importantly those by Hulin Patriarch Wifeng Zongmi and Linji Master Dai Zongge, Jinul created a sudden enlightenment followed by gradual practice dictum that he outlined in a few relatively concise and accessible texts. From Dai Zongge, Jinul also incorporated the Wadu method into his practice. This form of meditation is the main method taught in Seon today. Jinul's philosophical resolution of the Sangyo conflict brought a deep and lasting effect on Korean Buddhism. Late Goryeo. The general trend of Buddhism in the latter half of the Goryeo was a decline due to corruption, and the rise of strong anti-Buddhist political and philosophical sentiment. However, this period of relative decadence would nevertheless produce some of Korea's most renowned Zen masters. Three important monks of this period who figured prominently in charting the future course of Korean Zen were contemporaries and friends, Gyunghan Baegun, Tobu and Naon Haijun. All three went to Yuan, China to learn the Wadi practice of the Linji school that had been popularized by Jinul. All three returned and established the sharp, confrontational methods of the Inge school in their own teaching. Each of the three was also said to have had hundreds of disciples, such that this new infusion into Korean Zen brought about considerable effect. Despite the Inge influence, which was generally considered to be anti-scholarly in nature, Gyunghan and Naon, under the influence of Jinul and the traditional Tongbulgyo tendency, showed an unusual interest in scriptural study, as well as a strong understanding of Confucianism and Taoism, due to the increasing influence of Chinese philosophy as the foundation of official education. From this time, a marked tendency for Korean Buddhist monks to be three teachings exponents appeared. A significant historical event of the Goryeo period is the production of the first woodblock edition of the Tripitaka, the first also known as called the Tripitaka Koreana. Two editions were made, the first one completed from 1210 to 1231, and the second one from 1214 to 1259. The first edition was destroyed in a fire, during an attack by Mongols in 1232, but the second edition is still in existence at Haeunsa and Gyeongsang. This edition of the Tripitaka was of high quality, and served as the standard version of the Tripitaka in East Asia for almost 700 years. Suppression under the Joseon dynasty. In 1388, an influential general named Yi Songhai carried out a coup d'état copyright and established himself as the first ruler of the Joseon dynasty in 1392 with the support of this Neo-Confucian movement. He was posthumously renamed Emperor Taejo of Joseon in 1899. Joseon Buddhism, which had started off under the so-called five doctrinal and two meditational school system of the Goryeo, was first condensed to two schools, Zen and Gyo. Eventually, these were further reduced to the single school of Zen. Despite this strong suppression from the government, and vehement ideological opposition from Korean Neo-Confucianism, Zen Buddhism continued to thrive intellectually. An outstanding thinker was Ji 1376–1433, who had first studied at a Confucian academy, but then changed his focus to Buddhism, where he was initiated to the Guan tradition by Muek Jaecho. He wrote many scholarly commentaries, as well as essays and a large body of poetry. Being well versed in Confucian and Taoist philosophies, Jiwa also wrote an important treatise in defense of Buddhism, from the standpoint of the intrinsic unity of the three teachings, entitled the Yeonjeong Non. In the tradition of earlier philosophers, he applied Cheong and Wariam. Common in the works of Joseon scholar monks are writings on Wariam-related texts, as well as the awakening of faith in the Mahayana, Sutra of Perfect Enlightenment, Raw to the First Gama Zatra, Diamond Sutra and the Heart Sutra. The Jogye Order instituted a set curriculum of scriptural study, including the above-mentioned works, along with other shorter selections from eminent Korean monks, such as Jinul. During the Joseon period, the number of Buddhist monasteries dropped from several hundred to a mere 36. Limits were placed on the number of clergy, land area, and ages for entering the Sangha. When the final restrictions were in place, monks and nuns were prohibited from entering the cities. Buddhist funerals, and even begging, were outlawed. However, some rulers occasionally appeared who looked favorably upon Buddhism and did away with some of the more suppressive regulations. The most noteworthy of these was the Queen Munjeong, who, as a devout Buddhist, took control of the government in the stead of her young son Myeongjol, and immediately repealed many anti-Buddhist measures. The queen had deep respect for the brilliant monk Bu, and installed him as the head of the Zen school. One of the most important reasons for the restoration of Buddhism to a position of minimal acceptance was the role of Buddhist monks in repelling the Japanese invasions of Korea, which occurred between 1592 and 1598. At that time, the government was weak from internal squabbles, and was not initially able to muster strong resistance to the incursion. The plight of the country encouraged some leaders of the Sangha to organize monks into guerrilla units, which enjoyed some instrumental successes. The righteous monk movement spread during this 8-year war, finally including several thousand monks, led by the aging Haijong, a first-rate Zen master and the author of a number of important religious texts. The presence of the monks' army was a critical factor in the eventual expulsion of the Japanese invaders. Joseon is also known for continuing efforts toward the unification of Buddhist doctrinal study and practice. His efforts were strongly influenced by Goryeo, Jinao, and Jihyo. He is considered the central figure in the revival of Joseon Buddhism, and most major streams of modern Korean Zen trace their lineages back to him through one of his four main disciples, Ujung, Ryunji, Taenmung and Ilzeon, all four of whom were lieutenants to Joseon during the war with Japan. The biographies of Joseon and his four major disciples are similar in many respects, and these similarities are emblematic of the typical lifestyle of Zen monks of the late Goryeo and Joseon periods. Most of them began by engaging in Confucian and Taoist studies. Turning to Zen, they pursued a markedly itinerant lifestyle, wandering through the mountain monasteries. At this stage, they were initiated to the central component of Zen practice, the gun, or Guan meditation. This Guan meditation, unlike Zen traditions, did not consist of contemplation on a lengthy, graduated series of koans. In contrast, the typical Korean approach was that all gun are contained in one, and therefore it was, and still is, quite common for the practitioner to remain with one body during his whole meditational career. Most often Soto Kenshin's Mu, Buddhism during the 3 centuries, from the time of Joseon down to the next Japanese incursion into Korea in the late 19th century, remained fairly consistent with the above-described model. A number of eminent teachers appeared during the centuries after Joseon, but the Buddhism of the late Joseon, while keeping most of the common earlier characteristics, was especially marked by a revival of Warrium studies, and occasionally by new interpretations of methodology in Zen study. There was also a revival, during the final 2 centuries, of Pure Land Buddhism. Although the government maintained fairly tight control of the Sangha, there was never again the extreme suppression of the early Joseon Buddhism under Japanese colonial rule. During Japan's Meiji Restoration during the 1870s, the government abolished celibacy for Buddhist monks and nuns. Japanese Buddhists won the right to proselytize inside cities, ending a 500-year ban on clergy members entering cities. Jado Shinsha and Nichiren schools began sending missionaries to Korea, and new sects formed in Korea such as One Buddhism. After the Japan-Euro-Korea Treaty of 1910, when Japan annexed Korea, Korean Buddhism underwent many changes. The Temple Ordinance of 1911 changed the traditional system whereby temples were run as a collective enterprise by the Sangha, replacing this system with Japanese-style management practices in which temple abbots appointed by the Governor-General of Korea were given private ownership of temple property and given the rights of inheritance to such property. More importantly, monks from pro-Japanese factions began to adopt Japanese practices, by marrying and having children. In 1920, the Temple Ordinance was revised to reorganize temple administration and allow the Japanese government to directly oversee the 31 main temples in the country, with new headquarters at Gangsa. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, Korean Buddhism was placed under greater control. Japanese authorities had many temples' artworks shipped to Japan. Negotiations for the repatriation of these artworks are still ongoing today. Buddhism and Westernization. When Korea was liberated by the surrender of Japan in 1945, the celibate monastics of what has become the largest sect of Korean Buddhism in terms of adherents and the number of clergy, the Jogye Order, began to take over for the married priests who ran the temples during the occupation. This order sees itself as the primary representative of traditional Korean Buddhism in existence. The Taego Order is the second largest order of Korean Buddhism and includes both celibate and married monks. This is the only order that maintains the full Korean Buddhist ritual tradition. South Korea starting in the 1950s, Syngman Rhee and others worked to further divide and weaken the Buddhist Sangha in the country. Rhee campaigned in 1954 against the so-called Japanized Buddhists. Western education and scholarship, and the empowerment of women and the poor, caused divisions among Koreans. Specifically, a deep rift opened between married priests and celibate monks, a carryover from Japanese Buddhism's influence during the occupation period, though there had been calls for an end to celibacy from some Korean monks before Japan's annexation of the Korean peninsula. The differences were so great that fist fights over the control of temples became frequent. Monks, mostly belonging to the celibate Jogye order, threatened to kill themselves. Many of them were against the married clergy. As the Buddhist riots continued, the influence of Buddhism lessened. Buddhism continued to lose followers to Christian missionaries, who were able to capitalize on these weaknesses. From the 1960s onward, Buddhism has grown considerably, through the formation of independent lay associations, with many focused on youths, particularly to propagate and evangelize Buddhist teachings, fellowship and spiritual development, based on the Protestant model. These adaptations have modernized Buddhism in South Korea. Moreover, the South Korean government began devoting substantial funds to restore and reconstruct historic Buddhist temples, helping to revive Buddhism in the country. President Park Chung-hee unsuccessfully attempted during his rule to settle the dispute by building a pan-national Buddhist organization. However, he did succeed in allying himself with the celibate faction, the Jogye Order. It was in 1970 that Korean Buddhism split into a fully celibate order which retained the name Jogye, and the Taego Order that includes both celibate and married clergy. The Taego Order retained the traditional red kasa, whereas the Jogye Order changed their kasa to brown to visually differentiate the two orders. Both orders continue to use the Dharmakataka Pratimoksha, the lineage of vows for monks and nuns taken in China and Vietnam, though Taego monks have the option of returning the vow of celibacy. When the Jogye Order was founded, the government only recognized a small group of celibates and practitioners as legitimate. Thus all of the ritual specialists remained with the Taego Order. In the 1980s, President Chun Doo-hwan, a Methodist, adopted anti-Buddhist policies and attempted to restrict Buddhist activities. During his administration, many historic temples were converted into tourist resorts, which deprived temples of their autonomy, as these national parks were government-run. Consequently, Buddhists, especially the Jogye Order, were highly critical of these measures. From 27 to October 31, 1980, during the Cheongseon persecution, the government raided major Buddhist temples throughout the country, including the headquarters at Seoul's Gyeongseon, under the guise of anti-government investigations and an attempt to purify Buddhism. 55 monks were arrested and many others were interrogated and tortured, including the abbot of Nixansa, who died from the abuses. None of the investigated monks were ever charged, although many were sent to re-education camps. Throughout the 1980s, the Buddhist community was kept under strict surveillance of government agents and many were prosecuted under false charges of supporting communists or conspiracy. To Buddhists, the construct of a state protecting Buddhism had vanished, which served to radicalize a generation of Buddhists, including monks and laity, and propelled them to start a movement called Minjung Buddhism. This modernization emphasized ordinary people and was a reaction to aggressive Christian proselytization in Korea. From the mid-1980s to date, Buddhism has expanded through media and education. There are two major Buddhist media networks in South Korea, the Buddhist Broadcasting System, founded in 1990, and the Buddhist Cable TV Network, founded in 1995. Buddhist orders are also affiliated with or operate 3 universities, 26 schools and 16 seminaries in the country. The Kwanam School of Zen is one of South Korea's most successful international missionary institutions. During the 1990s, conflicts between the South Korean government and Buddhist leaders, as well as with fundamentalist Protestant denominations, continued. The government accused Buddhism of immorality and many Protestants used this to forward their missionary work. Some religious gatherings have even turned violent, vandalizing statues of Buddha and Dangun, the mythical founder of Korea. Soon after the Buddhist Broadcasting Service's FM radio station was launched in 1990, young men vandalized and destroyed sound facilities worth $200,000 USD. There was also a rash of temple burnings in the 1980s and 1990s, and attacks on Buddhist artwork have continued. In one instance, a Protestant minister used a microphone on a cord as a bolo weapon and smashed temple paintings and a statue. In other instances, red crosses have been painted on temple walls, murals, and statues. Buddha statues have also been decapitated. Furthermore, students at Buddhist universities report aggressive attempts to convert them on campus, especially near campus temples. On and off, sectarian tensions between fundamentalist Protestants and Buddhists occasionally rise due to what has been seen as a tendency of government officials many of whom are Christians, especially of Protestant denominations to tilt the political balance in favor of Christians over Buddhists, which has led to discontent within the Buddhist community. Of particular note was after Lee Myung-bak's ascendance to the presidency when the high proportion of Christians in relation to Buddhists in the public sector became known particularly the president's cabinet, where there were 12 Christians to only 1 Buddhist. Among other reported incidences. Recently, the South Korean public has become increasingly critical of Protestant churches and leaders attacking Buddhist institutions and carrying out aggressive missionary tactics, with many Protestants leaving their churches and converting to either Buddhism or Catholicism. The growing discontent with Protestant Christianity in South Korea has contributed to a spiritual and cultural revival of Buddhism in South Korea, with the number of followers increasing in recent years. The new presidency of Park Geun-hye aims to help contribute to the suppression of Protestant attacks against Buddhists and Catholics in South Korea, with increasing calls for religious cooperation in the country under the administration. During the first year of the Park administration, a national message was delivered for the celebration of Buddha's birthday, a contrast from the former Lee Myung-bak presidency which tried to suppress Buddhist influence in South Korea. North Korea The regime in North Korea actively discourages the practice of religion, including Buddhism. Currently, the country claims to have about 10,000 active adherents of Buddhism. As with other religions in the country, Buddhism came under the close scrutiny of the country's government including worship at Buddhist temples by monks, through the state-sponsored Korea Buddhist Federation. A major temple is Cheontae, which was preserved by Kim Il-sung. Nevertheless, Buddhists in North Korea reportedly fared better than other religious groups particularly Christians, who were said to often face persecution by the authorities, and Buddhists were given limited funding by the government to promote the religion, given that Buddhism played an integral role in traditional Korean culture. Current situation The Seon school, which is dominated by the Jogye order in terms of the number of clergy and adherents, practices discipline traditional Seon practice at a number of major mountain monasteries in Korea, often under the direction of highly regarded masters. The Taego order, though it has more temples than the Jogye order, is second in size in terms of the number of clergy and adherents and, in addition to Seon meditation, keeps traditional Buddhist arts alive, such as ritual dance. Modern Seon practice is not far removed in content from the original practice of Jinao, who introduced the integrated combination of the practice of Guan meditation with the study of selected Buddhist texts. The Korean Sangha life is markedly itinerant for monks and nuns pursuing Seon meditation training. While each monk or nun has a home monastery, he or she will regularly travel throughout the mountains, staying as long as they wish, studying and teaching in the style of whatever monastery is housing them. The Korean monastic training system has seen a steadily increasing influx of Western practitioner aspirants in the second half of the 20th century. It must be noted, however, that the vast majority of Korean monks and nuns do not spend 20 or 30 years in the mountains pursuing Seon training in a form recognizable to Westerners. Most Korean monks and nuns receive a traditional academic education, a modern academic education, and ritual training. Those who do spend time in meditation in the mountains may do so for a few years and then essentially return to the life of a parish priest. Currently, Korean Buddhism is in a state of slow transition. While the reigning theory behind Korean Buddhism was based on Jinal's Southern Enlightenment, gradual cultivation, the modern Korean Seon master, Sonchul's revival of Huineng's Sudden Enlightenment, sudden cultivation has taken Korean Buddhism by storm. Although there is resistance to change within the ranks of the Jogye order, with the last 3 supreme patriarchs' stance that is in accordance with Sonchul, there has been a gradual change in the atmosphere of Korean Buddhism. Antagonism from Korean Protestantism. Fundamentalist Protestant antagonism against Buddhism has increased in recent years. Acts of vandalism against Buddhist amenities and regular praying for the destruction of all Buddhist temples have all drawn attention to this persistent hostility against Buddhism from Korean Protestants. South Korean Buddhists have denounced what they view as discriminatory measures against them and their religion by the administration of President Lee Myung-bak, which they attribute to Lee being a Protestant. The Buddhist Jogye Order has accused the Lee government of discriminating against Buddhism by ignoring Buddhist temples in certain public documents. In 2006, according to the Asia Times, Lee also sent a video prayer message to a Christian rally held in the southern city of Busan in which the worship leader prayed feverishly, "Lord, let the Buddhist temples in this country crumble down." Further, according to an article in Buddhist Christian Studies, over the course of the last decade a fairly large number of Buddhist temples in South Korea have been destroyed or damaged by fire by misguided Protestant fundamentalists. More recently, Buddhist statues have been identified as idols, attacked and decapitated. Arrests are hard to effect, as the arsonists and vandals work by stealth of night. A 2008 incident in which police investigated protesters who had been given sanctuary in the Jogye Temple in Seoul and searched a car driven by Jigman, then the executive chief of the Jogye Order, led to protests by some claiming police had treated Jigman as a criminal. In October 2010, students from Church Equipping Worship School posted a clip on YouTube professing a hope that God would destroy a Buddhist temple in Seoul. Later they claimed being taught such by God. "This place will be demolished and God will win it back. Useless idols here made me really sad," the student said in the clip. Following public outrages sparked by the video, Reverend Choi Ji-ho and students from the school went to Bonjeonsa Temple to apologize for the comments made by the student. See also, Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, Essence Function, Hyecho, Hwaed and Goseon John, Lives of Eminent Korean Monks, Kim Ha-sang. Korean Buddhist Temples, List of Korean Buddhists, Han Yong-un, Religion in Korea, Sutra of Perfect Enlightenment, Tripitaka Korina, Varasamadhi Sutra, Wonkook. Notes. References, Baker, Don. Looking for God in the Streets of Seoul, The Resurgence of Religion in 20th Century Korea. Harvard Asia Quarterly 534 €39. Hong Baryi, Taehan Pulgyo George Yijing. Korean Buddhism. Kumsok Publishing Company, Limited. ISBN 89-86821-00-1. Scoville Pope, Brian. Go Tell It Off the Mountain, Missionary Activity in Modern Korean Buddhism, Thesis, University of the West, Vermiush, Sem The Power of the Buddhas, The Politics of Buddhism During the Karaite Dynasty. Cambridge, Harvard University Press. ISBN 9780674031883. OCLC 213407432, Yoon Sung-yong, The Movement to Reform Korean Buddhism, Korea Journal 52. Number 3, pages 35 to 63. External links, Index of Buddhism.org, The Dead and the Dying in Korea, Jogye Order of Korean Buddhism, Taego Order English site, One Buddhism English language website, Cheontae Order Korean language website, Torn by Identity Christianity against Buddhism? Also shows a long list of events how Buddhists are discriminated in Korea. Buddhism in Korea, What is Korean Buddhism? Extensive coverage of the history. An article from the Seoul Times, Korean Buddhist clashes, South Korean Buddhist monks protest against pro-Christian bias, Korean Buddhists rally against pro-Christian bias, Buddhism in North Korea.